Good evening, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Hope you guys are having a great week so far. Kip here, your whiskey tour guide. And as mentioned, it's Tuesday, time for our Tuesday Toast to History. Today, and so as we're doing this series, we're not really going necessarily chronological. That would make sense, maybe in one regard, but we are kind of jumping around just to kind of keep it interesting, kind of jumping and hitting a few things. Last week we talked about the Whiskey Trust out of Peoria, Illinois. We've talked about the origins of whiskey, some different things like that. We're just going to kind of bounce around. This evening, we're going to look at the birth of Kentucky whiskey. Now, when we first started this country, in fact, before we started this country, we were colonists on the eastern seaboard, and we made some rum, and then when the sugar tax happened, quit making that, began to use that distillation art and used the rye that was accessible. We're making rye whiskey. During the Revolutionary War, we began kind of that migration westward into what today you and I would refer to as Kentucky, right? But at the time, it wasn't Kentucky. It was a part of Western Virginia. And it was carved out, and in 1786, parcel of land was carved out and named Bourbon County. Bourbon County became the home, the hub of this new whiskey that in 1792, so about 6 years later, we have Kentucky receiving her statehood. Now Kentucky whiskey kind of becomes its own thing, Louisville being the hub there, river, all that kind of good stuff. Now, to get into some of the Kentucky, so when they got there, they didn't have rye, which is what they had on the East Coast, but they had corn. So they began to make corn whiskey. And what we today call bourbon, what is our native spirit, if you will, we think of as bourbon corn whiskey, and that is accurate. But it wasn't our first whiskey. Our first whiskey was actually rye whiskey. Now, have you ever wondered where the term bourbon comes from? So when we were colonists and we were embarking upon this Revolutionary War against England, the superpower of the world at the time, listen, we didn't have a currency, we didn't have an economy, we didn't have a form of government or any type of structure of leadership, and we sure in the world didn't have uniforms, weapons, and munitions to fight a war. So when the Revolutionary War started, we had to be funded by other countries. One of the primary countries that funded us, because they didn't like England at the time either, was France. And within France, there was a particular place that was a high contributor to our war effort. And they are actually where we get the term bourbon from. When 1786, when Bourbon County was carved out, that was a nod to the Royal House of Bourbon in France, who is a large financier of our war effort. So even though bourbon is our native spirit, so to speak, it's not even our word. Bourbon is literally a French dynasty, the Royal House of Bourbon. Now, we jump all the way, again, kind of back. Kentucky receives her statehood. This corn whiskey now begins to just blow up. Everybody's loving it. It's going crazy. Then you get the Elijah Craig coming in, getting that toasted, that charred barrel, getting the first red liquor, they referred to it, and off we go to the races. Kentucky is, to this day, the motherland, right, of American whiskey. Wasn't our first whiskey. It's not where whiskey originated in this country. It's also not necessary to be bourbon to come from Kentucky. Those are all myths, but Kentucky still is Mecca, if you will, for bourbon in this country. But even that, we had to borrow from somebody else. But, what am I drinking tonight? Well, try to go a little old school. Got a little old granddad, bonded or bottled in bond, high rye mash bill. So it's a bottled in bond, 100 proof. And if you guys are enjoying the history as we kind of bounce back and forth, shameless plug, my book, Sweet Drams Are Made of These. This is a book about whiskey, but it's really a history book, and it's a whiskey history book. So we go through the history of whiskey and its impact on our social structure, from everything from economics to war to religion, as well as the history as we travel through the path of whiskey in America. And of course, America did not invent whiskey, but we have a unique story that no other country has, and that is that whiskey is literally interwoven into the very fabric of our existence. And as I close out tonight, just kind of briefly touching on Kentucky whiskey, Kentucky bourbon. Andrew Jackson was our 7th president, and he is noted to say that I have never seen a Kentuckian who didn't have a gun, a pack of cards, and a jug of whiskey. Cheers to Kentucky. Thanks for sticking with it, giving us what we got today. Cheers. Y'all have a great one.